General Motors was in trouble in the 1980s. Their inferior cars could not hope to compete with the superior Japanese and German cars. And in order to compete with those foreign powerhouses, GM would have to revise a 60-year-old corporate structure that does not allow for any change whatsoever. So when Saturn was introduced, it was designed to solve both of GM's problems. But it would have one of the most complicated paths in automotive history on its mission to build a different type of car. General Motors was considered the greatest automaker of all time when they had the American auto industry in a chokehold in the 1950s and 60s. For the first half of the 20th century, they built their brand upon some of the most innovative and highest quality cars in Detroit. But despite 30 years of dominance, the 70s would prove to be a nightmarish decade for the company. Amidst increased pressure from the government and public to make their large and heavy cars safer and more economical, they were getting obliterated in the sales department by a little bug-shaped German car with a funny German name. As the 70s bled into the 80s, a gas crisis and even more competition from an entirely different continent tightened the screws on GM as well. The Japanese automakers that had been almost non-existent in the US merely 20 years earlier were now selling cars that were better in almost every way than the ones from Detroit. Roger Smith, the chief executive of GM, acknowledged the need for a company that would be able to build cars that could compete with the foreign compact cars taking the world by storm, and also be somewhat removed from the greater corporation of GM, in order to imitate the corporate structure of Toyota in particular. And that company would be Saturn. The first Saturn concept car was shown in 1984, but it would take over 5 years for the first Saturn S-Series cars to hit the streets in 1990. The new cars would have features like plastic body panels that were dent resistant,
the Saturn Ion with dent resistant side panels. Saturn, people first.
And a 4-cylinder engine that was completely unique to Saturn. The company was also run completely differently than any other American car company, or any company within GM. This started with where Saturns were made. The Saturn plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee was a couple hundred miles away from just about anything GM related, and as a result employed people that were a little more enthusiastic about their jobs than the average Chevy or Oldsmobile workers. This was mostly due to the fact that their UAW contract allowed plant workers to give feedback to the engineers, allowing them to play a part in the design process, as opposed to just bolting together a bunch of Chevy Cavaliers. This strategy was very similar to the ones used by Toyota and other Japanese makers who were building those high-quality cars that made the era Chevys look like a medieval serf's ox cart. However, what wasn't similar to the Japanese brands was the experience of purchasing a Saturn. And this is where Saturn really differentiated themselves from any other automaker out at the time. Saturn dealers were Haggle-free, which meant that buying a car entailed paying the sticker price and not arguing for a couple hours with a grouchy old man in a coffee-stained suit. So, as a result of their separation from the established American auto industry, and the fact that their dealers were not staffed by a pack of money-hungry wolves, Saturn managed to sell 2 million S-Series cars by the end of the 90s. Saturn had proven that they could build quality cars, and that they had a loyal workforce and consumer base, mostly driven by ethical business practices. And as a result of this, Saturn was so popular in the 90s that they were able to hold multiple homecoming events at Spring Hill with tens of thousands of people in attendance. Despite the S-Series showing its age, Saturn still managed to have pretty solid sales going into the 2000s, when it would introduce the next model, the L-Series. Despite the success of the S-Series, GM was still struggling, and Saturn had yet to turn a profit. Also, due to the $5 billion or so that were dumped into Saturn from the start, the other divisions at GM had been resentful of Saturn from the very beginning. So when it came time for them to engineer the next Saturn, General Motors would resort to the same copy and paste BS that they had gotten oh so good at. The resulting car was a much more typical 90s GM product, which essentially meant it was a Frankenstein of a lot of different parts from a lot of different cars, and the quality was pretty laughable as a result. This sort of indoctrination into the GM cult of business management would continue through the 2000s and would get increasingly obvious with each car. By the mid-2000s, Saturn's lineup was exactly that, mid. The SL, which was Saturn's only car, had been fully phased out of production in 2002. Saturns were also no longer made at Spring Hill. Instead, GM decided that they would be made at a variety of different plants across the country, and even abroad. By absorbing Saturn into the greater corporation, GM was effectively destroying any future chances that Saturn had at the chance of continuing on as a different type of car company. And as the 2000s went on, Saturn lost more and more of its identity until in 2007 it was barely more than a Chevy or Vauxhall with a funny badge. Also, it's important to note that Saturn was already on its way out due to the witch's brew of toxicity and budget cuts within GM, but there was one more nail that was going to be pounded into their coffin.
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, when Saturn was conceived and peaked, the economy was relatively solid. But in the 2000s, a funny thing started to happen. There was a bit of a recession. And the second to last thing that people want to buy in a recession are cheap, knockoff Vauxhalls that are named after a 40-year-old rocket. But before GM fully axed the brand, Penske Automotive was trying to put together a deal to own the brand of Saturn and distribute them through a manufacturing deal with GM or another company. But that deal fell through and Saturn officially met its demise. Saturn didn't really have a lot of original designs, due to the fact that most of their cars were literally clones of existing Chevys and Vauxhalls. But the S-Series was their most unique car by far. It had plastic body panels, which were not really necessarily a new idea, but were at least somewhat novel for an American car in the early 90s. And the engine was also pretty good for the day, with a ground-up design and both single and twin-cam offerings. And from all the research I've done, it seems that these early Saturns were quality, easy-to-service cars. Saturn also dipped a toe into building performance cars with the Ion and View Redline models. The Ion Redline was basically a Cobalt SS underneath, so while it wasn't really that much different from the Cobalt, it's probably a bit cooler just because of how obscure it is, and the fact that it is supercharged. And Saturn also took a modified one to the Bonneville Salt Flats, where it reached 212 miles an hour, which is really a marketing stunt that could only happen in the 90s. And they also made a View Redline, which was an SUV. It was a GM product, but get this, it had a Honda V6. And it is really quite a confusing car, but it was one of the very first performance crossovers. Possibly the most significant car that Saturn had a role in producing was the GM EV1. Although it wasn't technically a Saturn, it was leased through Saturn dealerships and was the very first car that GM made that was powered by electricity. In the end, Saturn didn't really succeed in building a different type of car. The mighty General Motors corporate machine forced them into line with the rest of the company just as they were really starting to hit their stride. And due to GM's inconsistent management, Saturn is one of those funny companies that didn't really change much in the auto industry. General Motors had already made a car that consisted of plastic body panels. All in all, Saturn could be considered the more successful version of companies like Edsel or Scion, and those were companies that were somewhat desperate attempts at innovation by industry giants in the face of new competition. And they were not necessarily successful, but it set GM on the track to redemption and innovation 10 or 20 years down the road. So if you enjoyed this somewhat different style of video, please let me know in the comments or like this video, and I'll see you next time.